Good morning. My name is Malcolm Clemens Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral here in San Francisco, California. Welcome to the Fall Forum season. At the age of 21, the pain of losing her mother to cancer sent Laurel Mathewson, with a naturally skeptical and questioning outlook, on a years-long existential journey. Laurel began to read The Interior Castle, St. Teresa of Avila's book about the dwellings within our souls that we move through as we develop ever-deepening prayer relationships with God. In An Intimate Good, a skeptical Christian mystic in conversation with Teresa of Ávila, a beautifully written and moving memoir, she illustrates an ancient reality, still very much alive today, the love and closeness of a good God. We know this through Jesus Christ, who seeks to move out into the world, into our very bodies and lives. Not by nature or training inclined to believe such a wild claim, Laurel discovered that God is full of surprises. Today, we're going to be talking about bringing to life the complex framework and ideas of the interior castle, and also about the living God who is at the heart of it. Laura, we're so glad to have you in Northern California this weekend.
So glad to be here.
It must be like a kind of a homecoming for you.
It is. I'm glad to be back.
Yeah. We are having such good days these days. Although we're like a little worried that the National Guard troops might be arriving soon.
You never know. You never know.
We never know. Everybody's on their toes these days.
Yeah.
But anyway, I enjoyed reading your book so much. I fully immersed myself in it and enjoyed it. I was able to, at times I just felt like I was in the 16th century myself. You know? It kind of took me to a monastic place in myself.
Oh, good.
But I wonder if, for the sake of our audience, I wonder if you can talk a little bit in your first one or two chapters. You give just kind of a brief summary of who Teresa of Ávila was, what was the basis of her thought, and you talk too about the demands, the context in which she wrote from, the requirement that she needed to write these books, and the audience that she had in mind for them.
Yeah. So I always say, if I was introducing Teresa at a cocktail party, I would say she was a 16th century Carmelite nun. And she was in Spain, Spanish, and that's where the Avila comes from. She was a reformer, she was a mystic, and she was an author. So she had these three different sides to herself. She is a really prominent saint within the Roman Catholic Church. So she was the first woman to be named a doctor of the church in 1970, which is a designation given especially for contributions to teaching and theology. So it's a really significant honor that she was given. And that is really a tribute to the depth of her work. So the context a little bit is she started out like not every other nun, but she joined a monastery as a young woman. She was very fervent in her faith as a child, and then she had some really intense and memorable experiences in prayer as a young nun. But then she had this really interesting season of what we might call hypocrisy. She calls it more just, it was a time of pain where she was not really faithful in prayer, but she was kind of still teaching people about prayer. And then she has a really significant reconversion at the age of 39, within the convent still. And after this, she really moves into a new chapter in her life. And that's where all of the sort of most significant contributions that we know about come from. So she began her work of founding a whole new way of being a Carmelite community. So the community she entered had 180 sisters. She started communities that just had 11, with the intent of trying to get a community that would really foster prayer. If you think about 180 people living together, it's pretty busy, So she was looking for a way that she could support prayer life. That was the mission of the Sisters of Carmel. And so she begins this work, and then the church higher-ups are unsure about this work, of course. There's resistance to this reform movement, as there always is. And so she's asked to first write a book about her own spiritual life, which is her autobiography. And at first it's well received, but then she has a a funder who gets mad at her, a widowed princess who gets very upset with her and turns this manuscript into the Inquisition and says, I think you should look at this. So they sweep up all the copies of her autobiography, and she is, eventually they find nothing wrong with it, but for a time it was all taken away. And in the meantime, she keeps founding new convents, and around 10 years later, after the Inquisition had swept up her book, there's this sense that there's still a need for her teaching on prayer, which had been so valuable. And so basically another superior in the church, a priest who is very sympathetic to her work, says, I think you need to write it again. Basically, write it again. This time, don't make it so clear that this is you. Sort of write it under the guise of a third person. Like, I knew someone who had this experience of God in prayer. And so she, following this order from a superior, but knowing it will serve her sisters, also begins work on the interior castle, which is this masterpiece, a sort of a synthesis of two of her other books, talking about our spiritual maturity in prayer and how we sort of move closer and closer to the heart of God's love and presence within us that's always there, but kind of the landscape of those dwellings.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that was so powerful for me was that talk about the interior life, and just like how useful it is at every stage of human development. That we do find a kind of sustenance from God who is present in our heart. I wonder if you can talk a little bit of just, it's so interesting to hear about just how she was received in her own time, but how has her reception changed over time? What has her work meant, as society evolves and changes?
I mean, I do think like every major thinker and theologian, she has been received differently at different times. I include in this book a poem from like 16th century England, when her work began to be translated and make her way there. And it really set so many people's souls on fire, just this sense of like God's passionate love for us, entering a landscape where maybe that wasn't emphasized in the same ways. And so it really was scandalizing. She's often a bit scandalizing because there is this sense of God's deep passion and love for us that comes through in her work that some people are uncomfortable with. And so that's always been adjacent to Teresa. But I think throughout, she has stood out as someone who is simply passionate for God and is willing to play the fool for Christ and willing to have people not understand her. And so I think today, I think there's really a space for Teresa's teachings, because we have so much noise. We all know we're inundated with good news, bad news, false news, whatever. I mean, just we're all inundated with information. And Teresa teaches us, and she's taught the church and the people of God for almost 450 years, how to develop that inner relationship with God that is there for us, and we have that capacity, no matter who we are, to find those riches within. And that is, I think, a gift for all of us, no matter what age or culture we're living in.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to think. I mean, just we have a particular need for it just because of the technology that is just coming to dominate our consciousness so much. We had an AI and theology seminar for the Pacific Coast Theological Society here on Friday, and I was talking about what it's like to visit people in prison. People who aren't connected to the internet at all. They don't have cell phones. They don't have computers, and just their ability to concentrate and focus and create is so exceptional. Like, I just don't meet too many people on the outside who have those abilities anymore. So I can imagine, Teresa of Ávila has something that we really need.
Yeah. She actually talks about the metaphor of the interior dwelling places or castle. She has this image of, for those who don't ever take time to pray, to just sit in silence with themselves and God, it's like you're wandering around the castle grounds constantly. And it's there. It's not like it goes away. God's presence is there. But it's like now I think one of the greater challenges is it's always been a possibility to just kind of live your life wandering around the castle grounds. But now there's just so much stimulation outside on the castle grounds that I think it takes almost a greater intentionality to say, I'm gonna take some time and turn in.
Yeah. The dwelling places, that's the structure of the book. I
Mm-hmm.
wonder if there were dwelling places that were harder to write about or ones that were easier to write about. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So Teresa's book, The Interior Castle, is organized into 7 dwellings. And the first 3 are really places that I think most of us are much more comfortable with. They're the places that most prayer books talk about. Like, how do we approach prayer? What are the things that we can do? What are kind of the basic feelings and dynamics of our movement into prayer? And then what that looks like as we kind of grow, mature, and change. And then there's the 4th dwelling place, which is where she says supernatural experiences begin here. So that's because the last 3 sections, 5th, 6th, and 7th dwelling places, are really focused on what God does in prayer. And that's really what makes this a little bit different in terms of her work on prayer. She talks a lot about God's activity in our souls within. And so the 4th dwelling place was the hardest for me to write about and took the longest by far. And I actually started there because I knew it was kind of the meat of this dilemma. Like, how do you talk about just prayer, not ordinary, but just prayer, conversation with God, the things we've all been learning if you've been in the church for any length of time, and then this whole other sort of new world to me in terms of the mystical graces. But the 4th dwelling place is that messy middle. It is the messy middle space where there's what is happening here? Is this God, or is this just an overactive imagination? Did I eat an undigested piece of beef, as Dickens says? What is happening? And so the 4th dwellings was definitely the hardest or most challenging space to write about.
That's so interesting. I can imagine that. It just, there are different moments in the prayer life that speak to us in different ways. I think also it's hard to write about, you don't put it in this way, but the more advanced levels too.
Yeah.
Because I just don't think that we're as at home in those.
Yeah, it's always been very difficult. And she names that too. It's very difficult to do any sense of justice. It's sort of I'll say 1,000 foolish things if I can say one thing that will give glory to God. She says that at the beginning. It's
I love that.
Yeah,
I feel like that about preaching. I'm going to tell you a bunch of things. I hope one of these things speaks in a deep way to you.
Yeah.
And that's my deep longing, and I totally understand that methodology. One of the things that I've wondered about is, last weekend, or the weekend before, we had my old teacher. She was the first woman to receive tenure at Harvard Divinity School, and so this last week I've been thinking so much about her contribution to scholarship. It's Margaret Miles, who wrote about the body, wrote about female experience, but I wonder if kind of this new group of women who are now teaching in the universities, historians, how that's changed our impression of Saint Teresa. In a way, you're part of that.
Yeah, that's a really wonderful question. I think that I would answer with a story about Teresa, and her most famous statue is a Bernini statue in Rome, which you may have seen pictures of, and it's this, it's famous because it's so provocative. It's sort of Saint Teresa in ecstasy, and the angel is there with the darts. And what I noticed when I went back, I've only seen it twice, but I went back in 2022, and what I noticed is that there's this audience of men around. And I learned later, they were donors that were honored with having their faces around the statue. But they're really just in conversation around the statue, but no one is looking directly at Teresa. They're kind of talking amongst themselves. And I think that although men and women have appreciated Teresa's contributions, obviously, again, in the church she has been well regarded, I think there is a shift from sort of the voyeurism in a scholarly way too about Teresa to a deeper interest in what is she saying about how God, these graces of God are shared in her body and the sweetness of it is in her body? Can we talk about that without being completely scandalized and thinking that she is like a lunatic, in the way that women have often been cast off with any spiritual experience? It's a long history in the church, as you know, of like any sort of spiritual experience that women are having, that they then are empowered to speak with greater authority, which Teresa also experienced, leads to backlash. And so I think there's more seriousness in the way that people look at her actual experience and not just kind of who she was or how she taught afterwards.
Yeah, in a way we can hear her in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that you write a little bit about is just like, she uses all these different kinds of metaphors, but spiritual marriage is one.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you can talk about those images that she uses, maybe spiritual marriage in particular, but other ones too.
Yeah.
Which ones speak to you, and
Mm-hmm.
how do you make that translation for yourself?
Yeah, spiritual marriage is obviously a tricky one for us as moderns, postmoderns, to engage with. But I've come to believe there are a lot of riches to not disregarding it, to not throwing it out and just saying, like, that's from a previous time. Because Teresa herself is so aware that it's fraught and imperfect. When she writes about it from the beginning, she's like, look, I recognize this is imperfect and full of problems for us, but it's the best I can do, because at its best, marriage is a place of deep mutual love, of deep mutual belonging and partnership, shared work, collaboration. And so she, I think, is right to say this might be the best metaphor we have for where we are ultimately going or hoping to go in our relationship with God. Because who doesn't want that relationship of deep knowing, someone who really knows you, who treasures you, who wants to be with you, who sees you as you are and loves you still and makes you a better person? All the good things that we talk about with a beautiful and good and healthy marriage are true of the divine human relationship too. And so she, I think, and Jesus convinced me, like, this is something that is not just laughable. I used to be the person who, with like the, praise and worship songs that I would joke you could substitute like baby for Jesus. I'd be like, oh, like, what is this? Jesus and like the bathtub bubble songs. I'd be like, okay, this is not for me. And then I realized there's a reason that those songs exist. There's a reason that this is part of our vernacular as Christians, because it actually speaks to, again, that mutual belonging, mutual partnership in work and in the world, and that deep healing of belovedness. So I still love it now.
Well, I'll tell you, this is I guess I must have always just looked at that. Oh, that's a metaphor that's for someone else.
Yes.
And as you were talking, is the first time I ever thought, hey, maybe this will be helpful for me to understand the way that God loves me and the way that I love God. And it's not like it's not like a human relationship. I'll give you $14 if you give me that sandwich.
Right. Right.
It's I want to please God.
Yeah.
And God does please me too. Yeah, even as you were speaking, I was like, yeah, I'm starting to get it a little bit.
Yeah, and she talks a lot about, for like so many folks, and I would put myself in this, I still fall back into this pattern of thinking because it's so ingrained. I think we fall into this place of wanting to, we know God is good theoretically or intellectually or from some conviction.
Yeah.
And so we want to do good for God. But it also then becomes somewhat transactional, like whether we're conscious of that or not. Like, I will do good and be good and pursue justice and, try to live a good life. And then maybe, God will be good to me. And there is that, even if we don't like to explicitly say that, that can be there. And there is this challenge that Teresa puts to us to say, no, this is really about that full surrender to God and trusting God's love, and then the beginning of like a mutuality and a partnership that is beyond what we often imagine.
Yeah. That's like I said. I love that. It's so powerful. The book begins with your story about you and your daughter talking about church, and why aren't her friends, all of their families, going to church too? And it was such a powerful conversation, because I remember learning so much from my children as they were growing up. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, because now you are like one of the world experts on this, the difference between the faith of children and the faith of adults. Like, how does that look like to you? How do you understand the difference between, what children are experiencing when they're young, and what the way we experience faith as grown up and adults?
I think some of it is, the spirituality of children. If we believe the classical teachings of our faith, and we believe Teresa, and believe that we are made in the image of God, and God is present to us and within us. We don't have to look anywhere to find God. God is already there. Children often have a more unmediated sense of that presence. So, like when my daughter was young, she was not a particularly, she didn't talk a lot about God or Jesus. But one time she came in from where she'd like to swing on her tree. And I said, like, what were you doing there? She goes, well, that's where I go to talk to God. Just like going out there by her tree. And she just knew, like, I could talk to God right where I am. I don't have to go to church. I don't have to open my Bible. I can just talk to God right where I am. And I think that she had that sense. I see it in our church at St. Luke's. So many of the young children have this delight that seems just intrinsic within them about Jesus. And we get so skeptical and scaled over as we grow up. And so it reminds me whenever I'm teaching with the kids and they're like, they just have this, Jesus loves me. And I love Jesus. And I'm like, whoa, we lose that to the extent that it's a classic song, Jesus loves me, this I know. We get so jaded. By the time I was in seminary to be an Episcopal priest, someone had written the lyrics to that song on a whiteboard, and I was feeling so jaded and dismissive from that simple proclamation of Jesus's love that I took the marker, no one was around, and I wrote on the whiteboard, where? Question mark. Like, where does it say that Jesus loves you in the Bible?
Right.
Because it doesn't seem clear to me. I was really deep in this skepticism of we can proclaim that God is good, but where does it say Jesus loves you? So I think that watching children and being with children and their sense of if they have been even exposed to the ideas and stories of Jesus, even the name of Jesus, they kind of have this natural affinity that we then grow, I think, again, get scales of cynicism over as we make our way in the world.
Yeah. I think it's so interesting to see how children respond to things, because even in that anecdote, you're basically talking about like the problem that John Calvin had. Is just like, he preaches a sermon, and for some people it means everything. It's just like the difference between life and death. And other people are just like, oh, there goes John Calvin again.
Right.
He knows they hate it, and he knows these other people love it, and he just doesn't understand, like, why is it that the thing that speaks so much to some of us doesn't speak to everyone? And your daughter fully recognized it in the story, and then and was kind of okay with it. It didn't undermine her faith or anything. And I appreciate that too about children. But I think a lot about your childhood and my childhood, because we both grew up in Northern California and Oregon, in very secular environments. And I do think about how deeply formed I was in that secular worldview, and as have you been. And I wonder how you struggle with that. As how do you continue to cultivate that spiritual formation that has brought us closer to that Jesus who loves us, when so much of our initial training was just an empty universe of where there's no meaning at all.
Yeah, I think it's actually one of the reasons I'm so passionate now about teaching about prayer, because I think that we can read all day long. I still love to read, and I will read books. I can read books about spirituality and other things in the world. But I think that the real healing from that sense, from really the secular teaching of your cosmic insignificance,
Yeah.
comes in and through prayer.
Yeah.
Like, to make an intellectual assent that there is a God who sees us and knows us is okay, and that's the beginning. But to really be healed from that sense that, like, my life doesn't really matter other than to, like, the people that I might interact with, or that, just that sense of, again, I'm an insignificant group of cells in this,
And the
like,
goodness doesn't matter.
yeah. And so really, one of the reasons, again, that I'm passionate about prayer is I think that with or without deep, effective experiences, I believe that God meets us in prayers in the way that we need. Our constitution, our life, our background. God's going to work with whatever material is there to draw us closer to the reality of God's love and presence in whatever ways we're going to be able to receive. And so I think that it remains important for me, and like everyone, I can get busy and my prayer life can suffer, but that's really where the reorientation always happens, is for me in those times of prayer and refocusing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we were talking earlier about just women coming into like the academic world, becoming historians and medievalists and all that. But I think that's been one of the changes in my lifetime with women coming into the clergy, is a more of a focus on prayer. And we gosh, we had some program here within the last 3 weeks where we're talking about women coming into the clergy, and this worry that people aren't going to respect clergy anymore because like even women do it, and it was a terrible conversation. And my point was just like, who cares about that kind of respect? I'd much rather be in a church that talks more about prayer, and that where prayer is more of a central focus for us. But that's part of what I love so much about Sunday worship is, if you when you said, how do we know that God is good? I've thought of the Psalms, like Psalm 100 is what I thought of. But and it's this back to Teresa again, like, if Psalm 100 doesn't work for you, well, we got this hymn for you from
Right.
19th century. Oh, actually, we also have another 20th century hymn, and we have this reading from the book of Hebrews. I don't understand it, but maybe you will. And and then we have the Gospel of Luke today, and then we have the Eucharistic prayer that's been passed on to us for years and years. And so it is a lot of different ways that are just inviting us to just enter more deeply into God's life. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the Episcopal Church now. When you described your life growing up, you're like, yeah, I had things to do with the Presbyterian Church and the Methodist Church and the Episcopal Church, and I went to college and the Catholic Church, went down to El Salvador. So you had a lot of exposure to a lot of different denominations. And how did you like, what spoke to you about the Episcopal Church in particular?
Yeah, I think that there is a sense in which the Episcopal Church still has this wonderful gift of being a place where the historic liturgy and the beauty of the liturgy and again, just the gifts of the liturgy brought forth from the past are still maintained as those gifts that nourish our faith. And that was important to me after I had really been part of a Catholic community. I realized how much I appreciated that. And in retrospect, I also was part of a pretty liturgical Presbyterian tradition. So it wasn't that new. But then we also have this sense of evolving tradition and the sense that the Spirit of God, the living God, is still speaking to the church, to our tradition, and that we can make adjustments as God continues to reveal, as God did to Peter, with these things that you thought were unclean are not actually unclean. There's this sense of ongoing, with careful group discernment, ongoing kind of revelation. And so I was drawn to that mix of a place that was really thoughtful and open to changes and had this historic grounding. And so I think that was really at the heart of how we ended up there. The simple answer that we give is my husband was Roman Catholic, I was Presbyterian. We knew we'd end up in the Episcopal Church someday, but that's sort of like the deeper answer. And to be honest, I will say this because I want to point out the importance of parish ministry. The reason truly that we are probably Episcopalians is because we encountered a wonderful church in Washington, D.C., St. Stephen and the Incarnation. And it was one of the first churches to integrate African Americans and whites in D.C. in the 60s and 50s and 60s. A powerful witness. And that's parish ministry that does that kind of witness. And then the life of that community continued to be a space that nourished spiritually people who were seeking and working for justice in D.C. That was its whole life and mission, really. And we encountered that church and it was wonderful. And really, I thought, this is where I want to be. This church, this Episcopal church is actually really cool.
Yeah, I think about the same thing, just going to high school in Davis, California, and these just very faithful lay people. And like Mary Goshert was there, Suzanne Paglins was there. So like the first women who were ordained in California were all going there. And yeah, I mean, I'm still like kind of running on that. They gave me like this sense of momentum. They showed they cared about me. There was a place for me. There's something I could do to help the community. We had this old like botanist who would go and cut the greens for like the Christmas wreaths. And he wasn't strong enough to carry this stuff, so he took me. And so there's something that I could do to help the community. I taught kindergarten and Sunday school, was an acolyte. There was a way in which they could receive my gifts and form and help me. You're so right. That parish ministry, I hope that's what we're doing here every day too. That 50 years from now, you're going to go upstairs and one of those little kids who's in our Sunday school is going to be the rector of St. Luke's Church in San Diego or whatever.
Yeah.
How about the ordination idea? Like, when did that first come to you, and how did you decide to get ordained?
Yeah, I think in the loss of my mother, I faced, as many people do, whether you lose, whatever age you lose your mother at, there is some sort of existential crisis. But for me, it was bound up with the vocational crisis of my early 20s. She was 21 when I died. And so I was really searching for all the purpose, meaning, all of those things that are common at that age. But it was good in that it intensified my searching. I had that sense life is potentially very short, and I want to make sure that whatever I'm doing is the most aligned it can be with the gifts that God has given me. And so I really had discerned with the help of God and my community over time that my two primary gifts were text interpretation, working with texts, writing, sort of teasing out what's the heart of this text, and then just being with people one-on-one. And so, of course, I thought about academia and journalism and being a counselor or therapist. And then I was sitting at St. Stephen in the Incarnation one Sunday, and a woman got up to go give the homily and preach. And it just was like one of those thunderstruck moments where I thought, oh, she does those two things every week, interpreting texts and being with people one-on-one in important moments in their life. And that was the beginning of my discernment journey, where I just really started to ask a lot of questions and saw that this was maybe the place for me.
Oh, that's so great. I love that image of she get up and the curtain.
The curtain pulled, it would.
Like, that's my future.
It really was a curtain pulling back. Like, oh, she does those two things I've named as essential to who I am every single week.
Yeah.
Maybe I should do that.
And it's a great life. I mean, I absolutely love what we do, every day. I mean, people are like, oh, you sure are working a lot. I'm like, this is not working. Like, working is like being in a lumber yard carrying heavy 2x4s. Like, visiting somebody in the hospital who's dying. I mean, that's an incredible gift and blessing. And it's just hard to find the right balance between all the things we're called to do. But I wonder what seminary was like for you. I mean, it's funny because you may not even realize this, but in like everywhere it's very easy to know where you went to study undergrad at Stanford, but the word Sewanee doesn't come up very much in just all the press materials.
Yeah, yeah.
And I don't even know if there's a reason for that, or if it's just accidental, or
Yeah.
that didn't seem so important. But maybe you could talk a little bit about what that was like. I just remember first going to my first class in seminary and sitting in this classroom. It was Greek. And this incredible rabbi who's like knew Hebrew back in Latin and German and French backward and forward was my fellow student. He's sitting next to me, and I was thinking, oh my gosh, how am I ever going to make this? I remember that feeling of being in seminary. I wonder if you can talk about what seminary felt like and what kind of classes kind of opened your eyes to different things, what teachers, what was that experience like?
Yeah, so one distinctive early memory is that my husband Colin and I are both West Coasters. So he's from San Diego, I'm from Oregon. And so we go to this auditorium our first day, and everyone's standing up to introduce themselves. And I realized there are like 30 varieties of Southern accent in this room that I never knew about. And they were all commenting on each other's Southern accent, like, oh, Robert, he's got that great old Atlanta accent. And then they'd be talking about Lauren's accent from North Carolina. And I'm just like, whoa, I am in a totally different world. So in a wonderful way, Sewanee was like, not study abroad, but was a multicultural immersion experience in the best ways that those are, because I learned about Southern culture in a way that you can read about the South, all day long. I was an a history and American studies major, but there's something about living in a culture that will teach you about the layers, good and bad, beautiful, shadowy, of any culture that you can't really get from pages. And so that was an important and wonderful part of being in the South.
And it's a Christian culture too. I mean, like we talked about that before. It's like, it's one experience to just be a total outsider to like your dominant culture in San Francisco or in Portland. But it's another thing when your daughter is like, well, everybody goes to church, Mom.
Right. And in San Diego, none of her friends go to church. So yeah, I think that that was good for me. I also think, I think it was maybe part of the way that I needed to be shaped as someone who'd grown up in such a secular environment. And my household's not really religious, and certainly my education wasn't. And so I needed what one of my mentors says was like an Episcopal womb experience. I needed to go into the Episcopal bubble and really just learn a little bit more of the just sort of what it was to be an Anglican, to be an Episcopalian, to be a Christian in a community of other Christians, because that was so foreign to me as a West Coaster, to be in community like that. And so I think that was actually, honestly, one of the most I have a couple, of course, wonderful professors that have continued to affect my understanding of God and prayer. But I think that, honestly, that kind of deeply formative experience of being in that Episcopal womb was maybe the most important thing for me as I then headed out into my public ministry in San Diego, just feeling more comfortable and at home in my Christian skin.
Yeah, exactly. And in a way, it's your fellow students and the daily office. And
yeah, all that steeping, you're being marinated. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so great. I absolutely love to hear about that. And I always, even as you were speaking, I was like, oh, maybe I could go and, take a semester at Sewanee.
Yes, you should. Yeah, it's beautiful. 10,000 acres on the Cumberland Plateau. It's beautiful.
That sounds so great. Yeah, and I love California, but it's nice to get another changed places. In the book, you talk a lot about just people's doubts and people's, we have moments when we feel so close to God and moments when we're further away from God. Do you worry about doubt in your own life in terms of just like what your future might hold? Or how does doubt fit in with your understanding of faith?
I don't worry about doubt, because I really do think, as the old adage goes, that it is a part of a whole faith, that it's not like an aberration, it's part of it. But I think that what Teresa and other teachers of Christian spirituality over the centuries have taught us is that there will be seasons when there is a sense that God is not as close, God is not as present, and we might have to rely more on just that intellectual assent, and we're not feeling it. But one of the things that has really heartened me, and I've seen in my own life and through the witness of other teachers like Teresa, is that usually there is this season of doubt or a sense that God is not very close. It leads to a place where we might come to a renewal, a new place. So it's not like we ever go exactly back to the place that we were, but that there is some next place on that spiral of transformation where we are heading. And so Teresa herself talks a lot about really deep doubt in the 6 dwelling places. So we're far into the riches of mystical prayer. And she says, you'll come to a place where you think, like, did I just make all that up in my head? Like these things that I've written about and talked about, and was it just a figment of my imagination? Like there can be doubt for her that deep. But she says, but it will pass, and God will renew that relationship in a way that brings you to a new or different place. And that's the same thing St. John of the Cross talks about in the dark night of the soul, that sense of God's absence, is that there is that third place that we come to, that where God is known to us again, but in a different way or a new way. And I think that that's actually really beautiful and helps me, and I hope helps others to not feel as so afraid of those places that feel dry, that we feel a sense of our aloneness, even if there's some part of us that knows we're not alone, because there is that, I think, the promise that it's not forever, and that we should look to these folks who have walked before us who say, yes, it can get really dark, but it's not forever.
Yeah, I think of one of the things about children for me is just they just kind of accept things as they are. So they don't have this idea of like, well, God, you should be appearing to me in this way. Mm-hmm. Like I should feel you walking with me in this way. Mm-hmm. And it's just in the same way as just like with the kids, you're like, okay, we're moving to San Diego, and the kids are like, okay. I mean, we didn't ask them whether they wanted to move to San Diego. We're just moving to San Diego. And I do think that that's part of like what it means to accept God as a child, as an adult. It's just, letting God be God and appear and guide us in the way that God appears and guides us. But one of the things that just doesn't come out in like when we interact like now, and is really different from the book, is just, I mean, you're having very vivid spiritual experiences, and I feel the same kind of thing in my life. And I don't talk about them because I don't want people to think, oh, there's Malcolm, he's talking to Jesus again.
Yeah.
But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about those vivid spiritual experiences, and then just, how like when you receive a kind of message, because you'll put it in italics in the book, like how do you know that's from God? Like how do you discern that?
Yeah, so I want to hold on to both of those questions. So if I lose one of them, draw me back to it. There is a reason that St. Teresa is the patron saint for those who are ridiculed for their faith, because it is not a new thing to feel very vulnerable, to be actually quite vulnerable if and when we choose to disclose elements of God's movement in our lives. And so I take that seriously, but like Teresa, I believe for me, and I think for others too, that's a personal decision for everyone, there can be great healing and fruit for others that comes from us speaking judiciously about some of these experiences and saying, no, these things really do happen. Yeah. God does meet us in ourselves and does actually communicate to us. And that people get really, weirded out with that. But I think that that's why Teresa is such a helpful teacher, because she's so grounded about it. So I'll answer the second question, which is about how do we know if words are from God, of God, or just, from our own imagination, our own projections, our own desires. And there's a lot she has to say about that, but I will summarize what I think is a really helpful teaching, because I imagine my experience with pastoral ministry is that more people have had at least one of these experiences than they're willing to name, because they don't, it's too uncomfortable to say, well, God spoke to me, right? But I would invite you to think about if there's a time when you've had an experience like this. So she says, when words come from God, whether it's like one word or a sentence or, something, she said the first thing is their sense of power and authority and effectiveness. They affect what they say. So if the words are, don't be afraid, we're suddenly actually not afraid,
Right,
right?
exactly.
Like there's an effect
Yeah,
and
it's a
power and authority
speech
to those
act.
words. Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
speech act. It's like there is a sense of just power that is in those words.
I pronounce you husband and wife.
Yeah,
Not
it's
just
like
the communication.
yeah.
You now are husband and wife.
Yeah, and then the second part of it is that, or the third part is that we cannot forget. So there is a sense that we just there's a lot of things come into our minds about God. We all, if we think about God or we don't, but if it was really a communication from God, we cannot forget those words. They're like imprinted in us. And then the second thing, which I was skipping over because I forgot for a minute, is there is a sense of grace and peace, like a graciousness that is a part of it. Like that it leaves in its wake a trail of peace, no matter what it is, no matter how hard the thing is that God might be asking us to do or telling us we need to do. You need to confront your brother about his alcohol. I mean, that's just an example,
Yeah, right,
but
exactly.
there is a sense that like, even if what we hear is hard and difficult on the human level, we are left with a sense of deep peace. Like, this is right, this is true. And so those three metrics that she names for locutions or words from God, I think can be really helpful. But it takes time, and then that I think applies to any of those locutions or communications from God. But speaking to my own, some of my own experiences, I think that for me, and I think this is true for everyone, again, God will work with you as you need to sort of lead you along a path where you can trust. So it might be very slow building, right? Like, okay, I think this is God's presence with me. I'm not hearing anything. There's no words. There's no, like, it's just a sense like, okay, I think this is a strange thing that's happening within me, but I really think as I'm praying this psalm, this is God. And it can be a really slow build, at least for me it was, from these places of kind of uncertainty, that messy fourth dwelling place, to learning over time to trust that God is present to us and God loves us enough to deign to communicate to us. And so then there can be a greater openness and in God's full freedom, times where there is more kind of shared with us about what we need to hear in that moment.
Yeah, Jonathan Edwards, the 18th century a Puritan from New England, wrote a huge book called Religious Experience about the exact issue. It's interesting to see just the way that these great thinkers and great people of prayer they arrive at the same conclusions.
Yeah.
And are addressing like a perennial problem, which is that we're so egotistical, such egotistical beings. It's hard not to just like have our ego voice drown everything else out.
And actually be open enough, and that open-handed surrender to really listen and be even humble in what we are seeking. Like Teresa talks a lot about this. I would say her two key words are sort of humility and striving, which seem paradoxical, right? But she's going to say you need to be humble always in how you approach prayer. You can't be striving for any particular gift of God's presence. You have to remain open-handed. But then striving in that you keep showing up. You keep seeking God's presence in prayer. And I think that's important too. I do want to name, just because, sometimes particularities are helpful. I was reading something that reminded me it's not just Teresa, it's not just me, but they're one of the like physical manifestations of sometimes these spiritual experiences that has been around for a long time, but we don't talk about very often, is quaking or shaking, right? Our body like actually shaking. And this was one of the like sort of earliest things that started to happen to me. And I was like, I'm not a Pentecostal. What's happening? This is, I'm outside my comfort zone here. But where did the name Quaker come from?
Yeah.
It came
Quakers,
from
too.
that sense of sitting in silence until they were quaking with God's presence.
Yeah.
And we don't think about that. We just think about the Quakers and silence, But this is actually speaking to a physical experience and manifestation of a spiritual experience that is not new.
Yeah,
And,
that two whole bodies, the Shakers too. The
Shakers
Shakers
too,
and the
yeah.
Quakers, it's such an important physiological experience that we know these groups of people by that
Same,
experience.
but we don't talk about it anymore.
No, we don't talk about it anymore. One of the traditions we have at the cathedral, which I should have mentioned earlier, is we take questions from the audience.
That's wonderful.
So people write down questions on note cards. So Rebecca Nessel has the note cards if anyone would like to write down their questions. One of the things that you mentioned a little bit is just being married to Colin and just like what it's like to be an Episcopal priest who serves in a co-leadership role with your spouse. And I wonder if you can talk just a little bit about what that's like and what you've learned from that. Ellen Clark King was our vice dean here at the cathedral, and Jeremy was her husband. He was an Episcopal priest too. They gave us a wonderful model of like how to do this, but they weren't in the same
parish. Yeah. There are so many ways of being married, and there's so many ways of being a clergy couple, but Colin and I have found it to be quite rich to be priests together at the same parish, partly because we have young children, and it's a way of having a more integrated life that felt like the right fit for our family. But I will say, and I talk about this in the book, one of the things that has been a challenge for me, I think it's a challenge for many women, I'm sure some men as well, is finding that sense of really always still orienting myself to God first in terms of what am I called to do? How do I live out my ministry, prioritize my days? In ministry, it's always a question of prioritization because there's a million things you could do that are good. So how do you prioritize? And so one of the challenges for us as a married couple has been you can fall into the same patterns of, sort of doing what your spouse thinks is important, or what in our case, the sort of one person might have a stronger, clearer vision from the beginning. And for me, it was a process, it has been a process in the last 9 years of learning to really listen to and orient to that voice of Christ within who says, no, remember, you can't serve two masters. And Colin would be horrified to even think that I was using that term master. But really, the way that we orient, like who decides what that I do, even though we are co-rectors, we're equal in authority, there can still be these nuanced interpersonal relationship dynamics that allow for us to still, be persuaded that someone else's way is more important. And so since we're different people with different gifts, it's taken me time with God's help to say, I'm going to really follow what is Christ called me in this place, and you will do the same, and we trust that will be good for the church. We don't have to do ministry the same way.
Yeah, it was a helpful section in the book just because it was just so practical. And to just think, here is a practical problem of ministry, and here is, you're right, an answer that you kind of receive, which is, what do you do? And the answer is, recognize that we have this one single goal, and we may have different interpretations or understandings of how we interpret that experience, but we begin with that experience of the goal, like how do you serve Christ? This is just like a minor little thing in the book. Oh, I should probably ask this. I'll ask this question. So in the book you mention your spiritual director and giving you like a list of different books to read. And so the first question is like, tell us a little bit about spiritual direction. The second question is, Sarah Coakley was on the list, and maybe you can talk about other writers who you're interested in reading in the future.
Would you like me to answer that now? Yeah, spiritual direction. Yeah. So spiritual direction is, I think, the simplest and sweetest name for it is just having someone who is particularly a friend to your soul.
Yeah.
So because it is so countercultural to be attuned to these questions of what is mine to do in service of God and Christ? What is God calling me to do outside of the noise of the shoulds of whatever systems I find myself in, my family, my work. What is really mine to do? What is happening with my prayer life? Does God feel far away? Am I feeling really confused? Am I feeling really joyful and I have no one to share it with because no one else will understand this weird thing that's happening to me in prayer? So a spiritual director is a friend of the soul in that way, who can be someone who is just a companion along that journey, who might be able to point to other voices, other resources from past or present, who can support and accompany you too along your journey of faith. And I think that that's certainly how my spiritual direction has been over these years.
Yeah, and the reason I ask that is just for everyone watching this.
I highly recommend.
Meditation.
Yeah.
Seek it out.
Especially if you feel like, I don't really know how to start praying beyond Sunday morning, which is a completely normal thing to feel because we don't receive a lot of education in the nuts and bolts of praying. A spiritual director can be a great resource for that and help you problem solve like some of the practical problems of prayer. You need a time, you need a place, you need a space where you're not going to be interrupted. All those things we don't think about with prayer in the same way we do about exercise, right?
Completely.
We're used to problem solving for exercise, but I would say prayer is the same way. We have to actually problem solve around like, what is a good fit for us and our life? How can we do it well? Yeah. And then the question about who.
Yeah.
I have to say for a few years, I was really all about Teresa. I
love the recommended reading list, the bibliography.
Yeah.
It's so good to there's plenty of people who are just like very surface.
Yeah.
It's great to have one person who's like really like, I'm really going to understand all the things that are available on.
Yeah, I felt like she was really, I was invited to be in conversation with her for a long while. And so I'm just now kind of like opening up to lots of, new reading again and new theologians. So I would take your book recommendations as well. But I think that for lay folks, I'm really keen on James Martin's book, How to Pray.
Yeah.
It's like a wonderful primer. So if you're just feeling like, I just need a little something that's not, it is a wonderful primer on lots of different kinds of prayer, and I think he does a great job of kind of what I'm hoping to do with this too, is like encourage people to just try different things.
Yeah, that's great. So here's a question we have from our audience. What can Teresa teach us in these fraught and soul-changing times?
Mm-hmm.
I know, great question.
Yeah. So one of the things I'm so happy that question was asked, because one of the things I did want to mention is I think a lot of times people can think of spirituality as this like side compartment to the real world. It's like a sidecar. Like, okay, that's nice that you had these experiences in prayer or that you're doing these things, but it's just kind of like out there and it doesn't seem really integrated. But that's not what Teresa teaches, and it's not what the reality of the greatest mystics in general teaches. And so what I would say is Teresa teaches us to pray, teaches us to take seriously our life of prayer and what happens in our life of prayer. But the point of that is always, always greater strength to serve and love in our communities, in our neighborhoods, in our cities, and to do that with greater freedom. That we're not trying to people please. We're not trying to, we're not trying to just fit the boxes that have been set. When you know that you are loved by the creator of heaven and earth, and that maybe God has even given you a particular little work to do, there is a sense of freedom that comes with that is so powerful in the world. And so I think in these fraught times, we need more people to pray, because we need more people who are free to serve and to love in those transformative ways. And I'll use big names because they're names we recognize, but in James Cone's book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, he talks about two pivotal mystical experiences that changed the shape of our national life. And we don't talk about them, but they're there as, I would argue, the seedbed of what came after that. So one is in the life of Martin Luther King Jr., more famous moment, the kitchen table moment
Yes,
in
exactly.
Birmingham,
Yeah.
where he really felt like
3
God,
o'clock in the morning.
yeah, God
drinking
came
coffee.
to him
Yeah.
in fullness, one of these like, I'm enveloped by the presence of God moments. And it allowed him to then go forth with greater courage, with a sense of vocation and mission that was, we can all see, was incredibly powerful. The other one I like to name as a woman, as a mother, is the experience of Mamie Till.
Yeah,
So Mamie Till,
Yeah.
no one talks about this, but Mamie Till felt convicted in her soul by God that her son's life was meant to be a catalyst, and her son's death was going to be a catalyst for change in this country. And so it was that sense of conviction that led her to have the open casket, that led her to speak out in the ways that she did for months and years afterwards. And that also was born in a deep place within her out of this relationship with God that said, no, this is so important. I will stand up and face all of the social shame and repercussions and fight for this. And so I would argue in our own day, of course, we need as many people as possible to be alive to their work in the world and God's purposes for their life as we can possibly have, because that's where some of the most pivotal transformation comes from.
Yeah, and just think of that, just to break all those social barriers about how we hide the death of our loved ones, we don't talk about it, to have it all in the international news, and to to be that kind of a brave person. You're right. I mean, it takes an incredible life of prayer to sustain someone through something like that. Well, I can't believe it because I have like dozens of more questions for you about preaching and pastoral care. I can't believe we didn't talk about Sudanese, your congregation.
Yes. Oh, St.
There's
Luke's.
so much more to talk about, but the church service time.
I know, time rolls on Sunday. I'm very well aware.
But it's been such a pleasure to get to know you, and you give me so much hope for the future of the church when I see people like you and so articulate, and meeting you in person definitely makes the book so much more three-dimensional. In the book you mentioned just that you have a natural modesty, and you described how that it played out in Salvador, and I was like, I didn't really understand what that meant. And meeting you, and that's just one of the things.
Oh, thank you.
But what a blessing it is. Thank you so much for your service in the church and all you do to help us to hear God's voice.
Thank you.
And I have little notes at the end here. Please join me next week when my guest will be the composer and DJ Mason Bates, who is our 2025 artist in residence. We'll be talking about composing, his unique integration of electronic sounds into his work, the spectacular events he curates, and his residency with us. I encourage you to buy Laurel's book. It's available in the back with Rebecca, and you're always welcome to join us upstairs for the choral Eucharist at 11 o'clock. We rely on your support for the forum, so gifts of any size make a difference. There are many ways to give, including texting the word THINK, T-H-I-N-K, to 76278. And again, thanks so much, Laurel. What a blessing it is to spend this morning with you.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to worshiping with you all, and it really is just a joy to be here.
Yeah, thank you.